Welcome to another one of our lectures on Germany between 1945 and 1991. We're going to be looking at another period of German history. This is the period between 1949 and 1971, looking specifically at East Germany, or as it was known then, the GDR, the German Democratic Republic. This period is often known as the Ulbricht years, mainly due to the fact that the leader for most of this period is one Walter Ulbricht, leader of the SED. Ways of trying to understand this period of history in Germany has led to a number of different interpretations. One is the totalitarian version, which sees it as a continuation of the Nazi period, basically due to the fact that it has many of the similar features of the totalitarian regimes that preceded it. However, by looking at it in terms of periodization, it becomes a less simplistic way of studying this period by simply calling it totalitarian. Certain aspects we could say are totalitarian, but we can see other aspects coming into it as well. So for example, between the period 45 to 49, before the GDR is created, it is being moulded by the Soviet forces in occupation there up to 49. Between 49 and 61 we begin to see the establishment of the GDR, and again we can see many features of totalitarianism there, but even then it is not comparable in many ways to the period of the Third Reich. Then the period between 61 and 71 is often seen as so-called golden age of consolidation and economic liberalisation, and it's interesting to note that it would be very much different to what we might call a totalitarian. Dictatorial, certainly, but totalitarian, more than likely not. The Honecker period, we see more change happening here. As the period continues, we get to see more and more state power in certain sections, but the state also letting go of certain aspects, certainly to religious groups, and we're going to see more about that in further lectures. And finally, the disintegration and collapse between 89 and 90. We get to see in that the way the GDR had to let go, and the fact that many people didn't want the GDR to completely disappear, even though they were in opposition to it. When we are studying this period, we need to give a key note or a key look at the Socialist Unity Party. In June 45, the Soviets legalised all political parties, but due to the poor performance of the communists elsewhere in Poland and Hungary, they want to ensure that they have a lot of control, and so by and large force the old KPD and the SPD to merge in April 46. Now, many members of the SPD, you might think that might be against this, were not in opposition to this, mainly because it would mean a return to the situation before the First World War and the breakaway of the USPD and eventually the KPD in 1919. The SED was not the only party though, but it functioned as a hub for the anti-fascist bloc, which also included the Christian Democrat Party, the Liberal Democrat parties, and also later on National Democrats and Farmers. And the first two of those parties could be found in the GDR, the FRG as well. So we're not talking about a one-party state in the same way as, say, in the Soviet Union. Between 1948 and 51, you get to see the fact that the SED Stalinized into a new type of party. Unfortunately, what we see here, this means is the Social Democrats, by and large, were purged. Also in this period, we see the SED membership rising between 1.3 to 2.3 million over 40 years. However, having said that, there are many reasons for this, and it could be down mainly to advancement, not just in terms of the party, but also in terms of more basic amenities such as housing, education, etc. Many were likened to see themselves, members who were part of the party, would like to see themselves as workers, but really had they become middle class. And it's interesting to note that the flag of the GDR included a compass as well as a hand, and a compass representing the more professional aspects of the workers as opposed to purely the manual working class. When we look also at the setup of the GDR, we'll notice that in the same way as the FRG functioned, it needed to have a constitution, and in many ways it was very similar to the basic law. Bear in mind, of course, the GDR was a reaction by the Soviets to some extent, and by the SED to the creation of the FRG. So it's no surprise then that many aspects did copy directly from the basic law. So we get to see, for example, a bicameral parliament elected every 4 years, bicameral meaning say 2 chambers, a separation of powers between the Prime Minister and the President, and a guarantee of fundamental human rights. This is all fine and well on paper. How that functioned in everyday life, well, we'll see a bit later on. In reality, there was little direct democracy. People just asked to approve or reject predetermined distribution of seats, and all the ministries were controlled by the SED. So who was the leader of this period? Well, we mentioned before that it was Walter Ulbricht, born in 1893 and died in 1973. Born in Leipzig in the what became known as East Germany, or the GDR. He was joined the Spartacist League in 1918 and was a co-founder of the KPD, the Communist Party, after 1920. Also elected as a Reichstag deputy in 1928. During the Third Reich period, he is exiled in the USSR, and when he finally comes back to East Germany and helps create the constitution, he is appointed Deputy Prime Minister of the GDR, finally becoming General Secretary of the SED in 1950. In 1960, he became Chairman of the Council of State, which effectively is the Parliament or the government, and favoured a hard line of constructing socialism in half a country rather than pursuing reunification. Remember, Stalin was to some extent open to the idea of a united and neutral Germany, but to many respects, Walter Ulbricht was the polar opposite of somebody like Adenauer in the West, both wanting to ignore the other and try to create something in their own power base. In the 1960s, limited economic reforms were brought in, but unable to change with the times. More people's expectations were growing, and unfortunately, Walter Ulbricht wasn't able to bring the SED in line with those expectations. Finally, in 1971, he is ousted in a palace coup by Erich Honecker with Soviet backing. The Soviets saw him too much as somebody who was blocking any advancement of any new ideas that might be coming through. Honecker we'll deal with at a future date. One of the key events during this period is the June '53 uprising. What started as basically a demand for wages, higher wages, ended as a full-scale revolt against both the SED and the Soviets. In March 1953, Stalin dies. There is a power vacuum. Many of the leadership in Moscow see Ulbricht as too Stalinist and want to move against him. Also, at the same time happening in East Berlin, many of the workers who are building the new Stalin Alley, there's the flats along there, are demanding higher wages and go on strike. On the 16th of June, building workers start to, as I say, strike, and then there is further spontaneous strikes in many other cities. From this day, we see the Berlin strikers march on the ministerial district in Alexanderplatz. In the afternoon, more political demands. So it's not just striking for higher wages now. Now they are demanding many other changes, free elections, national unity. But then in the late afternoon, we see Soviet tanks impose martial law. So the tanks come in, the T-34s, and effectively stop any chance of this revolt spreading. The way the East German hierarchy interpret this, they call it a CIA organised putsch, or Tag X as it was known, by using teenage thugs. For the West Germans, they see it as a people's revolt against Soviet tyranny, which to some extent it was, but it's not the full story. So what are the key events politically in this period. When in 1949, as I said before, the constitution, or the people's democracy, was set up with a bicameral parliament elected every 4 years, supposedly, the prime minister and president, the guarantee of fundamental human rights. In reality, though, people just asked to approve or reject predetermined distribution of seats. Ministries controlled by the SED. 1952, the border with the Federal Republic is closed except in Berlin. 1954, return of full sovereignty to the GDR from the Soviet Union. 1955, the formation of the East German Army and the foundation of the Warsaw Pact. Basically meant that this was a defensive organisation, supposedly to stop the NATO attack. Basically, the members would be all the countries of the Eastern Bloc. 1960, President Wilhelm Pieck dies, and the office of president is abolished and replaced by Council of State, or the Staatsrat, which is dominated by the SED. The constitution is changed in 1968 and declared that the GDR is now a socialist state, and acknowledged the leading role of the SED, which is not what was said in the original constitution of 1949. And in 1971, as has been mentioned before, Ulbricht is replaced by Honecker. The economy. In the Soviet period, we see wide-ranging land reform, the expropriation of business and nationalisation of key industries. Bear in mind, remember, that the Soviet Union took large amounts of the factories and materials as parts of their reparations in this period. But what was left was then changed. Also bear in mind that East Germany, or the GDR, or at least the Soviet zone in this period, was very heavily ruralised. Very few major cities and very few industrialised cities. Having said that, large amounts of work was done in terms of this rural area, and 40% of the industries under state control, hundreds of hectares of land redistributed to peasants and refugees, which was very popular at the time. As has been mentioned before, it had only 30% of the industrial capacity, very few natural resources, and the smaller population of the FRG. So was set up as a planned economy focused on building up of heavy industries at the expense of essentials and consumer goods. So in other words, certain key foodstuffs were produced, but mainly build up factories. So very few things were made for the ordinary people, very different to what was going on in West Germany. Basically a very similar economy like many other of the Soviet states. Everybody had a job to do, however insignificant, and the prices were fixed administratively by the CPE, or the centrally planned economy, which didn't necessarily reflect the value of products' true value, but at least that everyone could afford basic foodstuffs. The entire year's economy planned in advance, rate of economic growth, utilisation of raw materials and labour, amounts of imports, exports, etc. Everything as part of a 5-year plan. Growth fell from 8% in 1950, which is very high, to 2.3% between 1960 and 62. Still, you have growth going on there, though. Bear that in mind. In 1963, you get the new economic system, which was designed to move away from heavy industry and to start producing consumer durables for people. This meant that there were better living standards. There were a series of secret international agreements with East Germany recruiting workers from Poland, Hungary, Cuba, Albania and Mozambique, and Angola as well as North Vietnam. They numbered 100,000 by 1989. Basically, this was to replace many of the people who'd left as part of the Republic flucht in the 1950s. Their working conditions were bleak, although they were officially equal to the German counterparts. The foreign workers remained at the bottom of the social ladder with almost no rights. Again, equivalent to the Gastarbeiter in the FRG. Between 1961 and 70, there was improved growth. The GDR became the strongest economy of the Eastern Bloc. Increased ownership of white goods like fridges, washing machines and TVs in the 60s and 70s. By 1965, over 25% of East Germans owned fridges and 48% owned televisions. By 1970, these figures had risen to 36% and 69% respectively.
the economy underpinned by generous welfare provision, but this would put a big financial strain on the planned economy. This is all well and